They seemed like the perfect couple. He was a hard-working man with a steady job, and she was a loving wife who always put their family first. Together they built a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared sense of purpose. Their journey began with simple dates, laughter-filled weekends, and eventually led to marriage. The birth of their daughter was the crowning achievement of their love story, adding another layer of joy and purpose to their lives. They settled into a routine, enjoying typical family moments, shared dinners, school activities, and family vacations. Like any couple, they had their disagreements, but they were nothing serious, just the occasional argument that came and went. The foundation of their life together felt unshakable, and their love seemed endless. It was a picture of happiness, at least on the surface. Over time, however, something began to shift. It started with her late nights at work. Initially, he thought little of it. She had a demanding job, after all. But then the late nights became more frequent. She started taking business trips, sometimes leaving for days at a time. Her meetings with foreign colleagues seemed to take on a new frequency, and the time she spent away from home seemed to grow. He began to notice little things: deleted messages on her phone, late-night notifications that she quickly swiped away, and conversations she refused to share details about. At first he brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the pressures of work, but the little signs kept adding up. His gut started to twist in knots as suspicions grew, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. As the days went by, the signs of doubt became more apparent. He noticed she was acting strangely defensive when he asked her about the long hours or the frequent trips. A simple question would set off an argument, her responses increasingly vague and evasive. He began to overthink, telling himself he was imagining things. After all, they had been together for years, and he didn't want to believe the worst. But the red flags kept popping up, small but undeniable. She became more secretive with her phone, guarding it with a level of intensity he had never seen before. Her work took priority over their time together, and she spent more hours at the office, often claiming to be buried in meetings. The more he tried to dismiss his growing suspicions, the more they seemed to manifest. It became harder to ignore the gut-wrenching feeling that something was off. The emotional turmoil built to an unbearable point. His gut instincts were screaming, and yet he had no concrete evidence. The sense of betrayal gnawed at him constantly. After a particularly tense night, when she returned home late again with a hurried excuse, he made a choice that would change everything. He couldn't go on living with this uncertainty. He secretly installed spy software on her phone, hoping to uncover the truth. His hands trembled as he did it, knowing the gravity of his actions. There was guilt, anxiety, and a sense of dread as he wondered whether he was overstepping. But the need for answers, real, undeniable proof, drove him to do it. The emotional toll it took was immense. He had been married to her for years, and yet here he was violating her privacy in a desperate attempt to uncover what he feared most. The emotional weight was suffocating, but he had reached his breaking point. The day he finally checked the recordings was the day his world shattered. He sat at his desk, heart racing, unable to breathe as he opened the file. As the audio played, his worst fears were realized. He heard her laughing, genuine laughter, not the polite laugh she would give him, but one full of warmth and intimacy. The conversation that followed was filled with flirtation, and he could hear the unmistakable sounds of someone other than him, someone who had taken his place in her life. The tears didn't come at first. Instead, he was consumed by a cold rage, followed by an overwhelming sense of betrayal and helplessness. The emotional shock was paralyzing. How could this happen? How could she do this to him, to their family? Each word she spoke in the recordings dug deeper into his heart, and the pain of knowing he had been replaced by someone else felt like a physical wound. The emotional toll it took on him was devastating. He could barely comprehend what he had just heard, and the overwhelming feeling of betrayal left him lost in a sea of anger and confusion. In the aftermath, the husband found himself isolated and numb. The recordings played over and over in his mind, each word more painful than the last. His body felt sick, like he had been struck by something he couldn't escape. It was as though the life he had known for years, his marriage, his family, had been reduced to nothing. He wanted to scream, to confront her immediately, but the shock held him in place. The betrayal felt too real to process all at once. He went through the motions of daily life, but everything felt foreign. His thoughts were clouded with rage, confusion, and a deep sadness. The reality that his marriage was no longer what it seemed set in slowly, and he found himself grieving the loss of a life he thought he had. His heart felt broken, and the world around him seemed to collapse. He realized with painful clarity that everything was over. He was left with nothing but the pieces of a shattered dream, and the process of mourning what he once had begun. When the time came to confront her, he found himself struggling to hold it together. He couldn't let her know that he knew. She had no idea that he had uncovered the truth. He approached her, acting like everything was fine, masking the hurt, the betrayal, and the anger that seethed beneath the surface. She acted innocent, trying to maintain the normalcy of their daily routine, but he could see it, the guilt in her eyes, the nervousness she couldn't hide. Still, she tried to maintain the facade, pretending nothing was wrong, but for him, everything had changed. He struggled to act normal in front of their daughter, who had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. He pretended for her, but inside, he felt emotionally detached, the connection between him and his wife long gone. The lies and deceit had eroded the bond they once shared, and now he was merely playing a role, going through the motions of a life he no longer recognized. The husband made a decision. He needed a final piece of evidence, a way to force her to face the truth. He compiled everything, the recordings, the photos, the videos, and stored them on a flash drive. He planned to give it to her at the right moment, when she wouldn't be able to deny what had been happening. It was a cold, calculated decision, and as he went through the motions of preparing the flash drive, he felt a strange sense of detachment. He knew this moment would change everything. The woman he once loved would no longer be the same person in his eyes, and the life they had built together would never be the same. But there was no turning back now. His resolve was solid. He had to do this, even if it meant losing everything. The emotional toll was heavy, but he was beyond the point of return. The silence had been broken, and now he would make sure she knew exactly what had happened. Overwhelmed by the weight of the situation, the husband decided he needed to get away, to clear his mind and find some peace. He took a few days off, leaving his wife and daughter behind. He went away with a friend, seeking solace in the temporary distance. The pain of betrayal was too much to bear, and the only way to cope was to escape it for a while. In those few days away, he found himself grappling with a mixture of emotions. There was the deep sorrow of what had happened, but there was also a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in what felt like ages, he wasn't weighed down by the constant reminders of his wife's betrayal. The pain was still there, but it was softer now, buried beneath a layer of clarity. He knew he couldn't stay away forever, but for those brief days, he allowed himself to breathe again. When he returned home, the atmosphere had changed. His wife was a wreck, tearful, pleading for forgiveness. She called, texted, and reached out in every way she could, begging for a second chance. But he didn't feel the rush of emotions he once would have. Her tears didn't move him. Her apologies felt hollow, as though they were coming from a woman he no longer knew. The emotional detachment was final. He had processed the truth and accepted it, and now he was beyond her pleas. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The bond they had shared was broken beyond repair, and no amount of tears could fix it. When he saw her face full of regret, he felt nothing but cold indifference. Her world was falling apart, but his had already been shattered. The husband finally accepted that his marriage was over. His wife's tearful apologies no longer held any weight. He looked at her, detached and emotionally numb, and told her that they were done. He couldn't continue pretending. Their marriage was finished, but for their daughter's sake, they would coexist, navigating the difficult waters of a broken family. He spoke calmly, without anger, as he made his decision. It was painful, but he knew it was the right one. He had to move on. He could no longer live in the shadow of the life they once shared. His heart had been broken, but it would heal. He would rebuild his life piece by piece, and in time, he would find a way to move forward. Life after the confrontation was a strange mix of emptiness and hope. The husband and wife lived in the same house, but it was no longer a home. They existed as roommates, sharing space for the sake of their daughter. The emotional connection between them was gone, replaced by an icy distance. For the husband, though, it was a chance to rediscover himself. He reconnected with old friends, explored forgotten hobbies, and even began dating again. Slowly, the pieces of his broken world started to come together. His wife remained distant, trying to hold on to the illusion of normalcy, but he could see through it. The spark was gone. He was no longer the man she once knew. She had betrayed him, and now she was a stranger. The life they had built together was a distant memory, and he was moving forward, even if it was difficult. Looking back on the journey, the husband reflected on how much his life had changed. The man he once was, the family they once had been ripped apart by betrayal. Moving on was not easy. There were moments when the pain threatened to overwhelm him, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving forward for his daughter's sake. The relationship with his wife was irreparably broken, but he would make sure their daughter had stability. Despite everything, he was determined to create a life filled with love and peace for her. His personal world had collapsed, but he would find a way to rebuild step by step. The heartache would stay with him, but he would move forward because that's what life demanded.